Welcome to the Allo.Capital podcast. If you're just joining us this season, we are summoning Allo.Capital, a new spinout from Gitcoin that is designed to build the capital allocation layer of the tokenized internet. I think there's big upside here. Capital allocation is a multi-trillion-dollar design space. VCs, governments, NGOs, and DAOs all have to allocate capital. But it's also a place we can start small. Every time you spend money, you are allocating capital. We are threading a through line, partnering with builders, researchers, and funders to figure out what on-chain capital allocation looks like and building it on-chain. If you want to learn more, you can visit our website at Allo.Capital, where you can download the book for free, play with some of our dApps, join the Telegram, or participate in the DAO. All right, my guests today are Devansh Mehta and Sejal Rekhan, co-authors of a new paper entitled A Roadmap for Funding Ethereum's Open Source Infrastructure. And today we are going to be discussing that report. Devansh Mehta is lead AI, public goods, and governance at the Ethereum Foundation, and Sejal Rekhan is an active contributor to Greenpill, Gitcoin, Allo.Capital ecosystems, as well as a researcher working on deep funding. And today on the episode, we talk about the new report that Sejal and Devansh have put on the ETH Research forum entitled A Roadmap for Funding Ethereum's Open Source Infrastructure. In this proposal, Sejal and Devansh talk a little bit about how open source funding has evolved in the Ethereum ecosystem and what the needs are now, and propose a solution, a campaign in which involves broad listening to the constituents of the Ethereum ecosystem, a L2 Beats style dashboard, which allows you to demonstrate Ethereum alignment and to track who is funding the Ethereum public goods, and then finally a pledge component that allows projects to fund their dependencies and to pledge to fund the dependencies of the Ethereum network upon which they rely. So I think that this is an interesting episode that happens at an interesting time in which the ecosystem is evolving, and I think you're going to enjoy it. Hi, Sejal. Hey, Devansh. How's it going?
Yep, going great.
Going good.
Excited about this post that you put up on ETH Research, a roadmap for funding Ethereum's open source infrastructure. What was the problem that you're trying to solve here? Give us a brief overview of the paper that you put up.
Yeah, I can start here and then Devansh can add. So, the idea was that currently a lot of projects in the ecosystem and especially open source repos are relying on funding from EF, right? Which is not sustainable. And the plan was that, okay, how do we step up to really take this away, take this sole responsibility away from EF, so that EF is not the only one that is responsible for it. And hence we sort of wanted to see what would it look like if we implement some of the things that we've mentioned about in the post. So yeah, and it was inspired by our conversation with Vitalik recently when we met him in SF, where one of the things that we're really interested in doing is like, how do we bring some of his ideas to life faster? And, a prompt that and after the dinner, I had the opportunity to reach out to him, and I was interested in understanding like where his head is at. And Devansh and I've been discussing about this too, like what next? So his prompt was very clear that, if we could work on a roadmap which talks about how we can take public goods funding to the next level in 2025, right? Is there anything that we could do to rally the troops in the ecosystem, right? Something that each L2 or DAOs or even NFT projects would be willing to deploy. And how do we, raise the standard of PGF by the end of this year? So this was a lot to think about. We took at least like 3 weeks, I think, so a few weeks to really, a lot of back and forth and discussion to come up with this. And here we are. Where we have laid this out. But yeah, Devansh, do you want to add more to, what prompted this and like maybe share more light on the problem?
Yeah, sure. I think like we need to start making the Ethereum economy circular, where it's not dependent on any exogenous funding that's happening to make the blockchain run and EVM tooling to work. But it's coming from the ecosystems itself, which are part of that entire Ethereum world. So how do we make the entire economy circular is like problem number one. Like that's the problem we want to solve. And then we kind of say that the first method to actually solve the problem is just having visibility into it. So that's what kind of leads to the idea of broad listening, seeing what is actually useful, what counts as funding Ethereum's core kind of repos and tooling, which is useful to the ecosystem, And then we get a leaderboard. I think we've seen with L2 Beat the effectiveness of a leaderboard, where you basically have all the L2s competing to decentralize, which is amazing. And like we have an empire. So I think having that empire role is actually very important. So creating that style of leaderboard for who is funding EVM tooling and Ethereum repos, that's kind of the second phase of it, like who is funding how much and having it in a leaderboard style. And then the third phase is just making it super easy for anyone to do it, like plug and play. You don't have to develop anything unique or spectacular. You just have to kind of integrate it with something that's already there and is relevant to your particular project. It's not some generic cookie cutter fund this kind of group, which is like helping everyone, but it's like these are the things which are helping your specific project run. And here's a plugin you can put to fund all of those people. So that's kind of the broad overview of it.
So what I heard here is that there's three phases: broad listening, an L2 beat style dashboard is the second phase, and then a way of pledging to fund your dependencies and actually funding open source in the third phase. Did I get that right? And and if so, can you say more about how the three phases support each other?
Yep. I can start. So that's right. The three phases are broad listening, NL to beat style, dashboard, and then the pledge. So first phase is broad listening. I definitely want to mention and give a huge thanks to Audrey Tang, who has inspired this phase. So broad listening is a concept that was actually tested out by a person called Ano Takahiro in Japan last year. He ran for the position of governor in Tokyo, and he had no background of being a politician or anybody from his family in politics. So what he did was very interesting. He created his own avatar. So that was basically an LLM which was trained on the public opinions, right? So he scraped the data or comments of public from X, different news sites on YouTube, and then sort of used that to cluster those comments into different opinions and different thinking of people to better understand his public, to better understand their concerns, right? And he got tremendous insights from that, right? He got to know what people want to see more investment in Japan, what are the kind of politicians people want. So there were so many insights generated, and that he used to make his manifesto. And then he also got citizens to weigh in on that manifesto, where people could actually submit, like discuss that manifesto. And then he did a manifesto 2.0, which his avatar was trained on, right? So which actually got him to, like, he was the highest voted person who was from a non-political background. So, the idea is like, can we use that to actually do broad listening in Ethereum, right? This is exactly what we want to understand. What is that ecosystem values? What are their biggest problems, right? What do people care about? What do they want to see getting funded? So that is broad listening. And obviously it doesn't have, it's just not doing this, but also like talking to experts or talking to key opinion people who have been in this space for so long, because that's really valuable. So doing both of these and then sort of using that as a base for us to define things or categories that needs funding. And it also very well aligns with Gitcoin 3.0 and Octant, where we want to, I think, see, hear the ecosystem and understand it better, and then use it to probably define eligibility and other things. So that's phase one. Devansh, do you want to add anything in phase one before we go to phase two?
No, I think you've covered phase one pretty well. Yeah.
Yeah. And then phase two is the dashboard, which is L2 beat style dashboard. It's actually, I think this is the idea that Devansh you came up with, and also inspired by Vitalik's blog, where he talks about, watch the watchers, like make the Ethereum alignment legible, right? So he talks about how these dashboards have been so important in the ecosystem, right? So where is the like we want a dashboard for public goods funding, right? Where we can see who is funding what, right? What is overfunded, what is underfunded, what are the gaps, what are the things that needs to be addressed, right? And the idea was, once we have phase one, and we will use this to actually create sort of a dashboard where we basically visualize all of this, right? And also some of the things that are already existing, right? For example, Optimism doing retro funding, and Gitcoin doing QF and other funding. So all of this also is going to be on the dashboard, so people can see, right, what are the areas which need more funding. And this is also sort of like creates a reputational incentive for people. Okay, I want to be seen as an ecosystem that, that is funding this. So that is the idea. And of course, there will be metrics and standards based on which this dashboard continues to exist. But yeah, so for, to begin with, we will use the results from phase one, which is broad listening, and some of the existing things that we already know to create this. And yeah, Devansh, do you want to add anything? And then maybe do you want to take on phase three?
Yeah, I can add to the phase two leaderboard system, which is that if we try answering the question today, that who has given more funding to the Ethereum core repos, Optimism or Arbitrum, it's actually not a very clear cut answer, and it's hard to figure this answer out because Optimism has done retro funding, but a lot of the retro funding has gone to dependents rather than dependencies. So something like Velodrome is a project built on Optimism and it has got retro funding. But that's different from Optimism giving to Protocol Guild, which is kind of funding Ethereum. So I think like a leaderboard style system looking at who is supporting, kind of who is making Ethereum run, who is funding their dependencies, would actually have to eliminate the dependence. So you can't like look at projects that are depending on you and how much funding you give them. So it will be very manual labor work where you actually have to look at each of the funding in retro PGF and see which one are dependencies, which ones are apps that are using the dependencies and kind of eliminate that. And in the case of Arbitrum, like they've been funding Prism, which is a core execution client for Ethereum, and they've been funding them from the beginning. And a lot of this funding is off chain. So there's no like easy way to just like write a Python script and immediately pull up how much money Arbitrum has given off Prism. But you would obviously have to account for that. So I think that's where a lot of the nuances and the gray area start coming in. Like even Base gave like one or two of their people to work on an EIP. So now should we account for the salaries of those people in the EIP? So I think it's like similar to how L2Beat manually looks at the code base of projects in order to figure out the decentralization stage. Like this sort of dashboard would actually have to manually look at each funding, see what qualifies, and when the funding is off chain, like because they're paying salaries of developers, actually follow up with them and say, hey, how much have you paid, and then add that to the leaderboard. So it's a very like labor and manual intensive process, but it's something which I see as needed in order to actually get people to start contributing, because the first step is visibility and like the reputational incentive. Like we've seen how it's kickstarted decentralization, having an empire like L2Beat. So I really think that's kind of the next step that we need. Yeah, and then we move to phase three. So do you want to give a quick overview of phase three as well, since you've done such a good job of phase one and two? Yeah.
Yeah, so I can give an overview, and then I think it'd be good for you to dive deeper. Yeah, phase three is, phase three is basically the pledge. It's actually very interesting. I think a lot of people are missing the nuance here, because one of the thing or feedback that we've been getting is like, oh, you can't ask for pledge again because, pledge is already happening to Protocol Guild, right? But there is a nuance, which is like it's 1% of the airdrop to Protocol Guild and 2% of revenue to your own dependencies, right? So these are like two different things, which Devansh, you should dive deeper into later. But yeah, that is one, the pledge that we start with. And another thing is also like, as much as initially we were very focused on, let's identify what is the shared infrastructure that needs to be funded. But then after obviously talking to ecosystems and the research, we realized that it's actually more important to get ecosystems to fund their own dependencies, right? And then we move to a part where we have identified some shared infrastructure, which is not just one ecosystem that is responsible to fund, right? And then we are proposing that we will enable each ecosystem to deploy their own dependency graph. And again, something very interesting is like once they deploy their dependency graphs, right, they have the repos, they can actually use from different mechanisms which mechanism they want to allocate weight to the repos, right? And once they do that, the 2% of revenue that we ask them to commit goes to those dependencies, right? Depending upon the weights that whichever mechanism they choose, came up from. So a lot, but that is broadly the two things that we have in phase three, which is the pledge and the dependency graphs. So that's phase three. Devansh, do you want to
Hmm.
maybe dive a little bit into the bifurcation of the pledge and
Yeah.
the graphs?
Yeah, so something which I've been like thinking about recently is the difference between being Ethereum aligned versus EVM aligned. And these two things are actually different. So if you look at someone like ENS is going down with the ship, like they will be there till the end because they are riding on Ethereum. Whereas some of the other projects, like I'm just going to throw a random name, like Blast is an L2, but like they are more EVM aligned than Ethereum aligned, if I had to make the difference. And that actually matters a lot in if you want to move beyond donations, because donations has like a limited TAM, a limited addressable market. But integrating your profit centers and cost centers is the framing that we've used in the post, which is that if you look at something like Twitter, it's able to create such a good product because the advertising division is funding uh, cost centers like community notes without any dominance by the ad division. Imagine if the ad division had to say, we are deciding how much money to give community notes. Like that would be a complete disaster. Like it's good that Twitter has like a C-suite or an executive that decides that okay, advertising division, like this money is now going to community notes and kind of you can't do anything about it. But we don't have that equivalent in open source networks. It's basically profit centers which hold all the cards, and cost centers are kind of asking for arms. So what we are proposing is that a more better integration between profit centers and cost centers. And the way you do that is by first setting very strict eligibility requirements. I think I've kind of given shit to Awaki about this as well, but like I feel like Gitcoin needs to do a better job at like tightening up the eligibility requirements. The difference between web like Web tooling and Web3 infra is like vague. And a lot of the Web3 infra projects should actually be in the dApps round. So I was always like kind of confused. And when I look at the list, I'm like, wow, like most of these I would not be considering as Web3 infra. So I think tightening up the eligibility requirements is the first step, and tightening it to such an extent that you only care about funding the things that your project is depending on. So if Blast is depending on Solidity, but it's depending less on, say, Geth, they should be giving much more money to Solidity than to Geth, because anything else becomes a donation, and that has a limited market and it's not going to solve the problem that we want to solve. So that's the first step, like creating the dependency graph, which lists out all of the different things that your specific project is depending on. Something like ENS is on one extreme, which kind of completely depends on Ethereum, and something like Blast, or even like a kind of a fork which uses the EVM but is not an L2, would be like on the other extreme where they benefit and they want to fund Solidity because it makes their blockchain better, but they might not want to fund consensus or execution clients because they are not an L2, they just use the EVM. So how do we actually accommodate for this entire range of projects and still get them to benefit by actually like kind of, I think the best way of explaining it is that if Solidity gets $100 in funding, that benefits the ecosystem by $1,000, but each ecosystem has to give more money than the benefit they would get. So that's why they just end up not doing it. And that's the problem we haven't solved yet. Like, how do we actually create that incentive for projects to take the pledge beyond the reputational incentive of the pledge? So that's kind of something which is still open terrain.
What kind of feedback are you looking for from the audience? So I know this is on ETH Research and you published it this week and you're looking for feedback. What have you heard so far and what types of feedback are you looking for?
I can go like definitely one feedback I am looking for is like different mechanisms for generating weights on the dependency graph. So we've proposed deep funding as one mechanism where AI predicts the weights and we use a human jury to select between the many AIs. Another one is like um, quadratic funding. Like I think quadratic funding would be a lot more effective if we were super strict about the eligibility requirements, so that even if more money goes to one project than another, it's still not that big of a problem because you've kept the eligibility so tight that even a bit of variance doesn't really matter. All the money is being used well. So that's another mechanism like quadratic. But what other mechanisms can we use for actually generating weights on the graph is like the first thing I want feedback on. And the second is also just how do you generate a dependency graph, and like different projects in the ecosystem that are hearing this podcast. Like if you had to list out all of your dependencies in your projects, like how easy would that list be to generate for you, and how can we make it easier for you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
This makes me want to take us on a little bit of a detour and just say, Looking forward to the first deep funding results episode, and please announce your results on this podcast, not another one.
Yes.
So looking forward to having you back to talk about deep funding and dependency tracking there.
Yes, I think the first time we'll talk publicly is at ETH. So we might beat you by giving a live talk there.
They have a bigger audience, but that's a good one. Yeah.
Yeah, it's ending on June 30th. So we have a month and a half from now to finally get our results. We've already got some preliminary results, which I can share on this podcast. It's not been shared anywhere else. That the level 1 dependencies are actually like decent weights. We've got a good division between 34 seed nodes. But when we move to the 5,000 dependencies of the seed nodes, the results are all over the place. So we really need like kind of more like help on like the dependencies of the seed nodes and how we can get good weights over there. But it seems promising. We've at least got decent weights between the first top level split.
I think publicly talked about deep funding in Greenpill podcast. Like the first announcement that was done was on Greenpill podcast.
Yeah.
So definitely
Yeah.
results have to be here. But yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I heard from people that are involved in public goods funding, in like ecosystem support at the EF, that they found out about deep funding through the Green Pill podcast. And so I think that there's like an open question, and that's a little bit of a shit post. Hopefully no one thinks I'm like dunking on them by saying that on the podcast, but it's an open question for me. How do we take the things that the Ethereum Foundation is doing sort of in a silo, or the things that the community are doing, and build a little bit more of a bridge, like a gray area, where the Ethereum Foundation and the community, which I think has a higher risk appetite to do crazier things, how can we sort of start to converge on funding the same things? And it feels like your ETH Research proposal about a roadmap for funding Ethereum is kind of like starting to converge on that. Like once you create this structure, both the Ethereum Foundation and top L2 treasuries can all be pouring money into the same sort of structure, and that feels really elegant to me. There's a data dashboard that came out the other day saying that the EF funds most of the ecosystem's public goods, but it's like the 5th largest treasury. So I think that there's a little bit of like bridge to be built between the community and how it's funding stuff, and what the Ethereum Foundation is doing.
So just going back, because you said like, what is the feedback we're looking for? So like Devansh mentioned, one is like which mechanisms. And I also am curious, maybe this is more long term, but I feel like there will be versions of mechanisms that will be needed. Like I am really bullish on like QF with whitelisting, which we did in Zozalu last year. I think that's pretty powerful. That gives voice, like more weight to the votes of people who are in the system or in the community, and still to the people outside, but less. I think those versions, it just blows my mind when I think about it. And if those can be used for some of these graphs and some of these things, it would be pretty sick. Yeah. But yeah, that's one. And the other is I'm also curious to, like, one of the things we're doing is we've started scraping the forum for broad listening, right? But obviously the challenge is like it's just so much information, like what really makes sense, where should we focus on, is one. And second is, if we want to do like expert interviews, if we talk to people who are deep into the system, who are those people, how do we do it in a way which is like not like 6 months project, but can be done in like few weeks, and then we have results, right? So that would be one. And I've been hearing like there are other ecosystems who have been actually working on some of these things already, even the dashboard. So I think instead of like reinventing the wheel, who are these people and how do we, make sure we come together? Because one of the things that we learned from deep funding was working with organizations who are already pretty much doing the same thing. It just helps do things like faster. So I think that would be the idea. So yeah, open to feedback and suggestions. And I'm seeing like a lot of comments on the forum, which is good. Like a lot of people have also reached out saying that we have been thinking about something similar, which is great. So I think now the thing would be to also how we converge and make it a positive sum game, as opposed to just being another group who's trying to do the same thing again. Yeah.
One of the things that I think is really beautiful, I mean, so Gitcoin's going through some changes right now. Gitcoin 3.0 is coming. We're figuring out what that means. But, I'm really interested in seeing how Gitcoin can derive value from the sense making that you're doing, the broad listening that you're doing. And then I think that also other organizations like Optimism, other organizations that fund Ethereum public goods, Optimism, Arbitrum, and, other public goods funding orgs like Octant can really can derive value from this deep listening, broad listening pilot, and use it to inform how their funding campaigns do. So I see you all making a completely broad tent, and I think that that's really amazing to see, particularly while we're in this moment where Ethereum is sort of resetting. And I think that there's sort of a reconfiguration of a lot of the public goods funding orgs in Ethereum right now. I think that this is definitely a key piece.
And Devansh, you want to say something?
No, maybe you can talk a little bit about how Gitcoin 3.0 intersects with this roadmap that we presented. Like, what is Gitcoin 3.0 and then the intersection? Yeah.
Yeah, we're still figuring out what Gitcoin 3.0 is, but I think we want to focus on Ethereum's biggest problems. And in order to do that, we have to sense make about what Ethereum's biggest problems are. And we've had a handful of people coming to us saying, hey, we have software that monitors Twitter and looks at the KOLs and what they think the biggest problems are. And so, yeah, whether we do sort of like town halls or we use distilled human judgment sort of ways of figuring out what Ethereum's biggest problems are, I think that an interesting thing to do would be then to define domains of those problems. So, say we identify that Ethereum adoption is not going really well right now. We could create a domain within which we fund Ethereum adoption initiatives. And, maybe that will include things like privy wallets that make user experience good, but it'll also include street teams that are going out and doing public goods funding in main streets across America. I mean, these are all just hypothetical, sort of taking you through the sense making about Ethereum's problems, designing a domain, and then designing a capital allocation campaign around that domain end to end. And I think that we're in the middle of a design sprint to see exactly what happens with this with the design of Gitcoin 3.0. But I think that in the past, people have known Gitcoin as very quadratic funding and open source software centric. And I think there will definitely be a quadratic funding and OSS component to Gitcoin in the future, but we want to work backwards from the biggest problems in Ethereum and try to solve those. And so if we can kind of like delegate the sense making to y'all in your proposal, or maybe side by side sense make and share information across both of those, that seems like a really effective multiplayer game that we could be playing. And then, I also add in Octant and Optimism and the Ethereum Foundation. Is there a way that we can all sort of blend those organizational boundaries and all support Ethereum together? I think it would be quite beautiful if we're able to do that. But yeah, that's just a little preview of Gitcoin 3.0 and how it fits in. And thank you for letting me take a pass in the podcast guest seat, Devansh. Thank you for playing host for just a minute there. Let me know if you have any follow-up questions on that. And if not, we can reverse roles back.
No, just like a follow up on the thing you said about how Gitcoin can work better with EF and Octant and others. I don't know if you
Yeah.
saw, but like Josh Stark recently posted the org chart in EF. And
Yeah.
that org chart actually is like really useful to see who is the right person to talk to for kind of working on, because EF is like, at least my experience in EF so far has been, it's like a bunch of very autonomous and responsible people. So you have to just find the right champion in the EF and then kind of things will happen. So that's at least been my interpretation and my feeling and my take on it so far. So now that the org chart is there, like see who is most aligned, who is most kind of wanting to solve similar problems as you, and then just work backward from there. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that this coalitional structure that starts with one organization funding an initiative, and then you get sort of like funding on funding on funding, can get really interesting if the top treasuries were aligned on what the biggest problems were and could allocate to them, and maybe get brand value out of sponsoring the matching pool. That would be a real win-win, I think, from my perspective.
Yeah. It was funny. Somebody commented, like, where is Devansh in this chart?
That's right. Yeah, Devansh, you're a
Yeah.
one-man team, so you weren't in
Yeah.
the org chart yet.
Yes.
But maybe that just means you're an enigma.
Yeah.
So I'd love to anchor us back on the proposal. Is there anything that I didn't ask about the proposal that y'all want to say? And Sejal, maybe I'll go to you first and then to Devansh.
Yeah, there's one part that I think is that has not gotten a lot of attention is the fourth part, which is, where we mentioned we need to do for game theory what we did for cryptography, which is essentially we are hosting So we believe that there is a community of, people who are experts in game theory, who are economists, right? And who are also deeply aligned with Ethereum, but it's just that they have not so far engaged with the industry because of, the reputation. But we feel that, we can actually bridge this gap. So to bridge this gap, we are making an attempt to host research retreat. Um, a huge shout out and gratitude to Juan Benet, who is actually with whom we are organizing this. So the idea is, how we can further um, dive deeper into credit assignment and some of these things that we have been talking about and observed in the public goods funding mechanisms, right? Can we bring some of the people from academics world and some of the people from the PGF ecosystem in our space together and dive deeper into it? So it will be a 2 weeks retreat. Applications are still open. It's called Impact Evaluator Research Retreat 2025. We will also share the link in the show notes. So I would love for people to, especially who are passionate about public goods funding space and who are working in the space, to apply. And yeah, and we will be also diving deeper into deep funding as a case study, because by then we will have the results. And yeah, hopefully we'll come out with some more experiments and frameworks that we can use and apply. Devant, do you want to add
Yeah, maybe like
more
one
about?
important thing is like how the phase 3 would actually play out in practice. So ideally, like 2% of the revenue gets programmatically channeled towards their own dependency graph. And if you had to kind of get some quick numbers about how it would look in practice, so ENS over a 12-month period, ENS earned about $31 million, and 2% of that to their own dependencies would be around 500 or $600,000. BlackRock distributed 25 million in dividend to its various clients and institutional people holding BlackRock Biddle. So if BlackRock wanted to support its own dependencies that make it possible, that would be around like 300 to 400K. So I think it's good that we have these like very specific numbers that we can kind of nail down on and make a clear ask as well. And it's not an ask born of altruism, which is currently what we've seen. Like when we ask people to give to Gitcoin's quadratic funding, or like, or like even the protocol guild pledge, a lot of that is like based on some form of altruism. Whereas here the pitch is that, hey, these are the things that are making your project work. And if they don't get funding, like your project is going to be affected. And I think to give another example of that, like Curve Finance recently had a vulnerability because Viper had a vulnerability. So if Curve Finance was actually able to pay Viper and Viper is able to be more secure, that also helps Curve Finance. So I think that's why it's so important to be kind of have tight eligibility, generate your own dependency graph, only fund the things that your project is depending on in the proportion of how important it is. So if Viper is super important for Curve Finance, like they should be funding Viper and not Solidity. So how do we actually get that level of nuance and like accuracy and fine tuneness to public goods funding is actually the main kind of prompt that we are trying to give.
Well, would encourage the audience to check out the proposal that's linked in the show notes. It's on the ETH Research forum, a roadmap for Ethereum open source infrastructure. And then maybe I'll move us towards our closing questions as we start to end the episode. If you all are maximally successful, what does the world look like in 5 or 10 years? And maybe I'll go to you first on this one, Devansh.
Yeah, I think maximally successful would be that uh, Ethereum is able to live forever because the projects that are building on Ethereum are paying for the software that they depend on and that they use. So there's no need for external injection of money anywhere because it's a fully circular economy where projects are paying, Ethereum is able to run, and more projects enter, and there's more money to grow Ethereum as well as a whole. So that's kind of the maximally successful vision, that we help Ethereum be like able to work for generations and make Ethereum live forever.
Yeah, definitely plus one to what Devansh said. And I think eventually, how we can export it to the real world and, what are the things that actually matter in the real world. We can use this to fund those, right? I think that would be something that I would really be interested in seeing. And yeah,
All right, final question. Is there anything I didn't ask that you want to say? Sejal, we'll go to you on this one first.
No, I think we've covered everything. I definitely want to highlight the residency again. We'll be closing the application soon. This is an attempt to bring the academics world and the PGF people together and actually have some of the things, the questions that we've been asking around credit assignment and how do we, reward the projects faster. Some of those answers we will have from this residency. So please apply. And yeah.
Devansh, anything to add?
No, I don't think. I think we covered most of the ground in like this episode already. One thing is that if we did create a dashboard, like what would be the like appeals process where if we choose to reject something from being added to funding, how can that team complain and like how do we make such opinionated decisions and who should be making such opinionated decisions? I guess that's something which even I'm trying to figure out right now. So
It all comes back to governance.
yeah.
My idea on this could just be to have sort of a polycentric ecosystem. Polycentric just means many circles, and maybe you get left out of one curated list, one opinionated list, but you can go to others. And as long as no one lists or pool or circles has a dominance over all of the funding, you need to spend less time on appeals in specific decisions and more on just like finding your tribe. And so that's been what I think an elegant design looks like. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I just wonder how well that would have worked for an L2 beat style system, where it's
Yeah.
because we have just like one empire who's saying out or not out. I think that's kind of important as well. So it's the legitimacy of like having one empire versus the kind of allowing for that subjectivity of many.
States, we have multiple credit rating agencies that can rate different assets up and down. But it's interesting that like over time they all got captured and sort of all started to like pay to play. Like the banks pay them to do their ratings, and of course they want to serve the banks. And also they all sort of started, even in the financial crisis in 2008, they would all rate the crappy debt AAA. And so I think that there, like, maybe it's possible there could be many ratings agencies, but then there's also lots more capture vectors, the more complexity you add. So that's definitely a trade-off space. And public goods beats will be a really great project when you launch it, but the complexity here is much higher than L2 beats. So just curious how you'll navigate that. And I hope that when it actually does launch, come back on the podcast and would love to talk to you about it.
Yes, definitely.
I think that's a great place to wrap. Sejal, Devansh, keep up the great work. Thank you for everything. And for the listeners, check out the post. It's linked in the show notes. Bye, y'all.
Bye. Thank you.
Alrighty, we just heard from Devansh and Sejal. I am excited to hear what comes out of the broad listening pilot and the residency that they are planning. Thank you for listening to the Allo.Capital podcast. Again, this podcast features the people who are building the capital allocation layer of the tokenized internet. Disclaimer, this podcast episode is for informative purposes only and is not financial advice. Do your own research. Do not make any financial decisions based off of these episodes. In addition, disclaimer, I own crypto assets like ETH, USDC, and GTC. All right, I think Devansh and Sejal are in the frontier, and I hope that this has been a useful episode for you, listener, to figure out what's going on in the frontier and what the top minds in the Ethereum ecosystem are thinking about evolving public goods funding in 2025. Thanks again for listening, and see you on the next one. Goodbye.